Well, thank you for checking out this verse-by-verse Bible study podcast. I'm Randy Duncan, and in this episode, we'll be covering Genesis chapter 30. But before we begin, Larry, buddy, if you're listening, my prayers continue to be with you. Now, as a reminder, in the last episode, we discussed Jacob being manipulated by Laban, so that he has ended up working for Laban now for 14 years and marrying both Leah and Rachel. And we talked about the various dynamics in play throughout that whole situation. But we come now to the point where Jacob approaches Laban and says it's time for him to return to his homeland. And so with that, we begin chapter 30. Verses 1 through 8 read, "And when Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, she envied her sister. She said to Jacob, 'Give me children, or I shall die.' And Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel, and he said, 'Am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb?' Then she said, 'Here is my servant Bilhah. Go into her, so that she may give birth on my behalf, that even I may have children through her.' So she gave him her servant Bilhah as a wife. And Jacob went into her, and Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. Then Rachel said, 'God has vindicated me, and has also heard my voice and given me a son.' Therefore she called his name Dan. Rachel's servant Bilhah conceived again, and bore Jacob a second son. Then Rachel said, 'With mighty wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister, and have prevailed.' So she called his name Naphtali. So Rachel has not been able to have children, and she says to Jacob, 'Give me children, or I shall die.' Now this is simply hyperbole to express her extreme grief. In Rachel's mind, life would not be worth living without children. And in this ancient culture, there was a certain shame that society attached to childlessness. In fact, even the 1902 Jewish Encyclopedia noted that to be without child was regarded as the greatest curse. And so she says to Jacob, 'Give me children, or I shall die.' And ironically, and here's a spoiler alert, Rachel will die in childbirth in chapter 35. And so how does Jacob respond to Rachel? He probably could have chosen his words a little more carefully and seemingly with more compassion, because Jacob responds by asking Rachel, 'Am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb?' Piece of advice for you men out there. I wouldn't recommend responding like that. That wouldn't be my go-to. And although Jacob is technically correct, this sort of a short rhetorical response, it seems to just come across as a bit insensitive here. And so what does Rachel end up doing? Well, just like Sarah did, she resorts to offering Bilhah as a concubine to her husband. Now, we've already discussed this device of concubinage in an earlier episode, so I'm not going to go over that again. But Jacob apparently goes along with the plan. He sleeps with Bilhah, and she gives birth to a son. And although she is not the birth mother, Rachel will be the one that would actually raise the child, sort of like an adoptive parent today. And she says, 'God has vindicated me, and heard my voice, and given me a son,' and so she names him Dan, which comes from a root word, din, that means to judge or to vindicate. Fast forward, same thing happens again, and Bilhah again conceives and bears Jacob a second son, and they name him Naphtali. But the text tells us that then Rachel said, 'With mighty wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister and have prevailed.' And so she called his name Naphtali. So first of all, here we see recorded the birth of Jacob's son Naphtali. But notice something else. Rachel was so upset at not having children that she said her life was not worth living. But she was now already raising and loving and nurturing Dan. But apparently that wasn't enough, because she says after this son was born that she has, quote, wrestled with her sister and she has prevailed, which is why she names the child Naphtali. Again, which comes from a Hebrew word meaning to contest. And so we see Rachel's true attitude exposed here. It wasn't enough to have a child to love and to raise. She was in competition with her older sister. And it's actually sad that people can have an attitude like this, to harbor this sort of jealousy and to try to outdo one another. But unfortunately, it also reveals human nature. Verses 9 through 13 read, When Leah saw that she had ceased bearing children, she took her servant Zilpah and gave her to Jacob as a wife. Then Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a son, and Leah said, Good fortune has come. So she called his name Gad. Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a second son, and Leah said, Happy am I, for women have called me happy. So she called his name Asher. Well, Leah has obviously stopped having children herself. So, not to be outdone by her sister, she too now gets in on the concubine act and offers Jacob her servant Zilpah as a wife. Zilpah ends up giving birth to Gad and Asher. And by the time this is all over, 4 of Jacob's 12 sons will be born through concubines. Verses 14 through 18 continue. In the days of wheat harvest, Reuben went out and found mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother Leah. And then Rachel said to Leah, Please give me some of your son's mandrakes. But she said to her, Is it a small matter that you have taken away my husband? Would you take away my son's mandrakes also? And Rachel said, Then he may lie with you tonight in exchange for your son's mandrakes. And when Jacob came from the field in the evening, Leah went out to meet him and said, You must come in to me, for I have hired you with my son's mandrakes. So he lay with her that night. And God listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a 5th son. Leah said, God has given me my wages, because I gave my servant to my husband. So she called his name Issachar. So here we have this strange episode where Leah's son Reuben was out in a field, he found some mandrakes, and he brings them to Leah. Rachel then approaches Leah and asks for the mandrakes. But Leah responds by saying, Look, you've taken away my husband? Would you also take away my son's mandrakes? Ooh, shots fired, shots fired. But did you catch the self-righteous irony here? Leah accuses Rachel of stealing her husband when in fact it was actually Leah who did that to Rachel. So the exact opposite is true. And you guys are sitting there thinking that this only started with our recent political and social environment. Everybody blaming someone else. Everybody playing the victim. No, unfortunately, this has been the case from the very beginning with people, going all the way back to the garden, with Adam blaming Eve, Eve blaming Satan. Never, never underestimate people's ability to rationalize. Now, a word about mandrakes. In the ancient world, mandrakes were used as an aphrodisiac, and there was a belief that the mandrake plant had the power to increase sexual desire and induce pregnancy. In fact, Aphrodite, the Greek goddess of love and beauty and sex, was actually called the Lady of the Mandrake. So what is happening here is that these two sisters, who are in this sort of rivalry, reach an agreement that meets both their needs. Leah has children, but not the love of her husband. Rachel has the love of her husband, but no children. Leah desires love and recognition from Jacob, and Rachel desires children. And so they reach this deal where Leah will give the mandrakes to Rachel in exchange for Rachel allowing Jacob to sleep with her that night. So that evening when Jacob comes in from the field, Leah runs out and meets him and tells him what's up. And she tells him, You are to sleep with me, for I have hired you with my son's mandrakes. Understand this. Leah was so desperate for love that she resorts to hiring her own husband to sleep with her for the night. It's honestly sort of both sad and pathetic. But Jacob, once again it seems, does as he's told. And as we'll see, Leah gives birth to 2 more sons and a daughter without the mandrakes, while Rachel, with the mandrakes, will go 3 more years with no children. So much for the power of the mandrake, and so much for folklore and superstition. As a result of that night, though, Leah ends up pregnant and giving birth to another son, Issachar. And verses 19 through 24 continue. And Leah conceived again, and she bore Jacob a 6th son. Then Leah said, God has endowed me with a good endowment. Now my husband will honor me, because I have borne him 6 sons. So she called his name Zebulun. Afterward, she bore a daughter and called her name Dinah. Then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. And she conceived and bore a son and said, God has taken away my reproach. And she called his name Joseph, saying, May the Lord add to me another son. So Leah gives birth to another son and names him Zebulun. Notice what Leah says here too. She says that since I have borne Jacob 6 sons, now he will honor me. And that word honor in Hebrew means to raise or to exalt, and so once again reflects Leah's yearning for her husband's attention. But remember, Leah has had to actually hire her husband Jacob to achieve what she hopes will bring her what she desires, which is love and affection. You would think by now that Leah would have already realized that no number of children would cause Jacob to fall in love with her. I mean, love doesn't work that way. Love can't be manipulated. It can't be coerced like that. It must be freely given. Leah then gives birth to a daughter, Dinah. This is the only named daughter of Jacob, and perhaps she is named here simply because she is going to appear again in the terrible events that occur in chapter 34. But in verse 22 here, we see this sudden transition from Leah back to Rachel, when it tells us that God remembered Rachel, and he listened to her, and he opened her womb. So understand here, when the Bible says that, quote, God remembered, it doesn't mean that God had previously forgotten. I mean, God doesn't forget like we do. It simply means that God decided to act, and it's speaking anthropomorphically here. Rachel finally gives birth to a son and names him Joseph, who, of course, will go on to become one of the most recognized and revered people in all of Scripture, and he'll be the focus of several upcoming chapters in the book of Genesis. So this then completes the actual birth narrative, and so the focus now shifts back to Jacob and Laban. Verses 25 through 30 continue. As soon as Rachel had borne Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, Send me away, that I may go to my own home and country. Give me my wives and my children from whom I have served you, that I may go, for you know the service that I have given you. But Laban said to him, If I have found favor in your sight, I've learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you. Name your wages, and I will give it. And Jacob said to him, You yourself know how I have served you, and how your livestock has fared with me. For you had little before I came, and it has increased abundantly, and the Lord has blessed you wherever I turned. But now, when shall I provide for my own household also? So after the birth of Joseph, Jacob approaches Laban and he says, Let me return to my home. Jacob has now fulfilled all of his obligations to Laban. And now that God has blessed him and Rachel with the birth of Joseph, it's now time to prepare for his journey back home. And so he formally asked leave of Laban to take his wives and his children and return to his homeland. Remember, it's now been 20 years since Jacob left his home, fleeing from his brother Esau and to find a wife. Remember what Jacob's mother told him? Flee to Laban's house for a number of days until your brother Esau's anger subsides. Well, those few days have now turned into 20 years. Notice the verbiage that Jacob uses when he's talking to Laban here also. Jacob tells Laban that, quote, I have served you. In the Hebrew, that word for serve, it's actually repeated 3 times in this one verse. So Jacob is characterizing his time with Laban as one of servitude. And how does Laban respond? Well, Laban being Laban, he of course wants Jacob to stay. And I think there's something important here to notice. Just as the Egyptians tried to keep Israel enslaved, Laban tries to prevent Jacob's return to his homeland. Do you see the foreshadowing here? And just as Israel leave the oppression and the servitude of Egypt and return home, so will Jacob leave Laban and return to his home. Both Israel and Jacob begin their servitude with nothing, but they both leave the land with riches. So Laban tells Jacob that he has been blessed by God on account of Jacob. He says he's learned this through divination. Now, divination was forbidden in Israel because it presumes that spiritual forces other than God control the world. Some commentators interpret this as Laban just simply saying that, look, I've learned by experience that God has blessed me on your account. But either way, Laban acknowledges that God has blessed him on account of Jacob, and so he is not about to just let him leave that easily. And even though Laban admits to God's blessings upon him through Jacob, his confession does not lead to a change in his heart. There's no conversion. He continues to try and cheat and manipulate Jacob for his own gain. And I think there's a lesson here. Intellectual knowledge, that intellectual assent, it doesn't necessarily result in a change of heart. Knowing something to be true doesn't always result in a change of lifestyle. Knowing that God exists doesn't always drive people to lead a better or a more moral life. I mean, Satan knows the truth. In fact, he knows it much better than you or I do. But what good is that doing him? Just knowing something in and of itself is useless. It's what you do with that information that matters. Learning and hearing about Jesus and realizing that you cannot escape the truth claims of Christianity, it doesn't result in people suddenly converting and placing their trust and faith in Jesus. I wish it was that simple. But you also know that's not the case. In fact, Romans 1:21 tells us, "For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened." So Laban straight out tells Jacob, look, name your wages and I'll pay it. In other words, name your price. How much is it going to take? However much it is, I will pay it. You see, Laban's always focused on the material things. He's focused on the money. The Bible tells us that you cannot serve both God and money. But there's always an angle with Laban, and it's always about the money. Jacob responds by reiterating how much Laban has been blessed on his account, but also asks, look, at what point should I provide for my own household? Yeah, good question, Jacob. And so the conversation continues in verses 31 through 36. He said, what shall I give you? And Jacob said, you shall not give me anything. If you will do this for me, I will again pasture your flock and keep it. Let me pass through all your flock today, removing from it every speckled and spotted sheep and every black lamb, and the spotted and speckled among the goats, and they shall be my wages. So my honesty will answer for me later, when you come to look into my wages with you. Every one that is not speckled and spotted among the goats and black among the lambs, if found with me, shall be counted stolen. Laban said, good, let it be as you have said. But that day Laban removed the male goats that were striped and spotted, and all the female goats that were speckled and spotted, every one that had white on it, and every lamb that was black, and put them in the charge of his sons. And he set a distance of 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob pastured the rest of Laban's flock. So let's recap. Again, Laban asked Jacob, what shall I give you? And Jacob responds by telling Laban, you shall not pay me anything, but if you do this one thing for me, I will again pasture your flock. So Jacob doesn't want Laban's money. He offers to take care of the flocks for Laban, and his only payment would be that he would keep any of the spotted, any of the speckled sheep or lamb, and every black lamb, and that would be his wages. Jacob also tells Laban that later on, when Laban comes and checks out the flock that Jacob has, if any of them are not speckled or striped, then Laban should consider those as stolen. Now, a couple of things about Jacob's proposal here. Normally in the Near East, goats are either black or they're dark brown, and the sheep are white. But Jacob is saying that his wages would be only those abnormally colored sheep and goats. Now normally, the wages for a shepherd would be around 20% of the flock, and so rarely, if ever, would the speckled population of that flock be that high. So Jacob here is offering Laban quite a deal, because these varieties, these speckled and striped flock, they were very rare. And so, of course, Laban readily agrees to this deal since he thinks that he's getting a real bargain. But once again, Laban is going to be Laban, and a good bargain isn't enough for this greedy man. So what does Laban do? He goes and removes all of the striped and speckled from among the flock, gives them to his sons, and he sends them away so there's no chance for Jacob to breed them with the other flock. In fact, Laban sends them 3 days' journey away. So Jacob is starting with no abnormally colored flock. Don't you just love Laban? Everybody's favorite uncle. One other observation I would make here. Most of us were taught in high school about basic genetics and inheritance, and Gregor Mendel, who's called the father of genetics, and then also the random variation portion of Darwin and his theory of evolution and so forth. Both of these men lived in the 1800s. But notice that thousands of years ago, both Jacob and Laban, they already knew about genetics and inheritance and variation. And I'm sure these two men weren't special in that regard. That would have been common knowledge for any shepherd, just as it's been for any farmer, that the characteristics of animals that are born depend on the characteristics of the animals that are breeding. I mean, this is shepherding 101. Laban certainly understood it quite well, which is exactly why he goes and he removes all of the abnormally colored flock and sends them away, so that they wouldn't be around to breed, and so the likelihood of any abnormally colored flock being born would have been extremely low, and thus he would owe Jacob very little. Again, you just gotta love Laban, or as they would say in a lot of Baptist churches in the South, bless his heart. So to finish out the verses here in chapter 30, verses 37 through 43 read, Then Jacob took fresh sticks of poplar and almond and plane trees, and peeled white streaks in them, exposing the white of the sticks. He set the sticks that he had peeled in front of the flocks in the troughs, that is, the watering places, where the flocks came to drink. And since they bred when they came to drink, the flocks bred in front of the sticks, and so the flocks brought forth striped and speckled and spotted. And Jacob separated the lambs and set the faces of the flocks toward the striped, and all the black in the flock of Laban. He put his own droves apart and did not put them with Laban's flock. And whenever the stronger of the flock were breeding, Jacob would lay the sticks in the troughs before the eyes of the flock, that they might breed among the sticks. But for the feebler of the flock, he would not lay them there. So the feebler would be Laban's, and the stronger Jacob's. Thus the man increased greatly, and had large flocks, female servants and male servants, and camels and donkeys. So what in the world's this all about? Well, there are various thoughts and interpretations of what is actually going on here. It tells us that Jacob took fresh sticks of poplar and almond and plane trees and made peeled white streaks in them. And by the way, a plane tree is similar to a sycamore tree. But Jacob exposes the whites of the sticks, and he places these sticks that he had peeled in front of the watering troughs where the animals came to drink and also to breed. Now there's a thought that each of these plants used contained toxic substances used in the ancient world for medicinal purposes, which could have had an effect on quickening the estrus cycle in the animals so that they would more readily breed. Another thought is that is no more than superstition, similar to the mandrakes that Rachel thought would help her become pregnant. But we do know that Jacob also practiced selective breeding techniques here. Again, thousands of years before scientists were able to explain the actual genetic mechanisms involved. Jacob may not have been able to break out a microscope and see the dominant and recessive genes in play, but he certainly was experienced with the visual outcomes, just as any farmer or shepherd would have been. But either way, we know that the result was brought about by God's sovereignty and his blessing of Jacob. Verse 43 tells us that Jacob increased greatly, and he had large flocks, female servants and male servants, and camels and donkeys. And so the assumption here is that Jacob simply bartered and traded his strong sheep and goats to acquire those additional possessions. And this is sort of the climax of this chapter and of this scene. Jacob grew exceedingly prosperous. That Hebrew word for grew here means to break out, and it's the same verb used back in chapter 28 for God's promise at Bethel, demonstrating that the promise has now been fulfilled. And as a reminder, it's also important to see that Jacob, who will soon have his name changed to Israel by God, comes into a foreign land with nothing. He works as a servant, and then he leaves the land to return home with great possessions through God's blessings. Does that sound familiar at all? It should, because it foreshadows Israel's servitude in Egypt. God's transformation of Jacob's character is now well underway. Jacob's been on the receiving end of the same sort of deception that he was a part of with his father Isaac. And he has been humbled, and he will return to the land of Israel, not the land of Isaac, not the land of Jacob or Abraham, but the land of Israel. But before he is fit to do so, it will require God to change his character. And you know, that sounds a lot like what Jesus does for us. I mean, there's no prerequisite, there are no requirements that your character be perfect before you place your faith and trust in Jesus. Jesus will meet you where you are. In fact, if you're waiting until you're worthy of Jesus to come to him, you'll never make it. It doesn't work like that. If you're waiting until you're, quote, good enough, well, here's a spoiler alert, you're never going to be good enough. And that's the bad news. But there is good news. And the good news is that's what the gospel is all about. The good news is that even though you're not good enough, and you never will be, that your sin has separated you from God, Jesus came to bring you back into a right relationship with God. That's what the cross is all about. That's what the gospel is all about. And all you have to do is accept the offer by confessing your sin, placing your faith and trust in Jesus, and begin following him. And when you do that, the Bible tells us in 2 Corinthians 5:17 that, therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old has passed away. Behold, the new has come.